Doom: The Dark Ages is dropping on May 15th, and we now have PC system requirements. And this reminds me a lot of what we saw with Indiana Jones, which runs a branch of the same engine, which is ray tracing is mandatory, and VRAM capacity is going to be a really big deal as far as scaling up settings. Also, I'm noticing that the CPU requirements do seem fairly high. Not absolutely insane, but I don't think you're going to be getting by on a lower end CPU. Anyway, let's get into some of the details here. So first of all, again, ray tracing mandatory. You need an RTX 20 series or newer generation NVIDIA GPU or an AMD GPU that's an RX 6000 series or later to have hardware ray tracing support. But the RTX 2060 is going to be left out because it does not have 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is mandatory. They do specify 8 gigabytes of dedicated VRAM or better. They include examples like the 2060 Super. Notice Super, the Super version had 8 gigabytes of VRAM, the original did not. Or the AMD RX 6600 or better. So 2060 not gonna work, and I don't think that's any joke because, for example, when I test out Indiana Jones, which I realize this is not the same game, but it does, like I said, use a branch of the same engine, also had ray tracing mandatory and high VRAM capacity amounts. So I'm not saying I think they'll perform identically, but I think we can learn some things that are probably still relevant. Do you see this frame time graph going up and down crazily worse and worse and worse, awful 1% lows? This is what happens on an RTX 4060 if you try to run 1080p Ultra settings in Indiana Jones. It just does not have the VRAM capacity to do it. So when they say you need this VRAM that they're specifying, I think they mean it. That being said, to get 8 gigabyte cards working, you can turn down certain settings in Indiana Jones. For example, I left everything else at the Ultra preset, but switched textures and shadows to medium, and suddenly the 8 gigabyte 4060 is doing just fine at over 80 FPS. So I have a feeling that when we look at Doom Dark Ages, that's also going to be kind of the case where it says you need 10 gigabytes of VRAM to go up to 1440p high settings. I think they mean it, but that doesn't mean you couldn't turn down individual settings like textures and shadows and try to get things under control. Anyway, let's get into a little more detail here. So these minimum settings to just play the game should get you 1080p 60 FPS low settings. So it is at least 60 FPS, but they are specifying low settings for 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Like I said, I imagine certain customized settings can probably work out for you there, but yeah, I don't think the 2060 baseline with 6 gigabytes is probably going to cut it. Now on GPUs, if we want to scale up to 1440p 60 high settings, we are here. This is 10 gigabytes of VRAM. They give, and notice that they really focus on the VRAM and less on the specific cards, although they do give examples of cards like the RTX 3080, which the original version did have 10 gigabytes, and an RX 6800, which is a 16 gigabyte card. Now, I'm not sure they're saying those will perform similarly, but they are saying they could both handle this. Now, generally, the 6800 would have worse performance than a 3080, and especially in ray tracing. But I will say that in Indiana Jones, again, my Indiana Jones testing is not guaranteed to be the same, but we might be able to learn some things. AMD GPUs do perform just fine in the ray tracing in this game. For example, an RX 7600, as long as it stays within its VRAM capacity, which at 1440p medium it couldn't handle, but at 1080p medium it could handle, it's around a 60 FPS experience. So it's not like AMD users are doomed. You got like Daniel Inception here, the old version of me. I didn't mean to pick my own nose. Sorry. Anyway, here. Anyway, the point is that even an RX 7600, which is the lowest generation from the 7000 series, can handle the game at 60 FPS despite it being ray tracing mandatory. And it can still look pretty good while doing it. Anyway, so that's some thoughts on that. Also note that they're saying the system RAM is going up from 16 to 32 here. Whether or not that's absolutely mandatory, we'll have to see. Then they also say that for ultra settings at 4K, 4K 60 FPS, and they don't mention resolution scaling, and I will say that Indiana Jones did perform pretty well without needing resolution scaling at a lot of graphics settings in my testing, so that might be not including resolution scaling, and they're not mentioning it here. We're seeing that they want 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and once again, I don't think that's a joke. However, again, you can probably turn down texture settings and shadow settings and things like that to get maybe a 12 gigabyte VRAM card to be pretty performant there and keep most of the settings at ultra. Anyway, they're giving examples of GPUs like an RTX 4080 or better, or a 7900 XT or better, and that's pretty beefy GPUs. But again, if you were using upscaling and turning down certain key settings, I imagine other GPUs like a 4070 Super might still be able to give you a reasonable experience there. Now, I also don't think that these are the maximum settings in this game. So let's talk about that for a second. We'll have a bit of a lighter colored background, so just warning on that, flashbang warning, 3, 2, 1, okay. Anyway, I've seen that Doom: The Dark Ages, when shown off at CES, did include some interesting things. First of all, path tracing. And second of all, they talk about using ray tracing to enhance gameplay. So that's really interesting. So let's actually talk about this for a second. So number one, they did show off DLSS 4 and path tracing. This is another thing that Indiana Jones did, which is they didn't have DLSS 4 right off the bat, but Indiana Jones did have some path tracing modes. And those were gonna take a lot more performance in order to get there. Now, still on a card like a 4090 using DLSS quality, you could still get some playable frame rates and everything like that. But again, that's a beefy GPU like a 4090. 4K DLSS quality on maxed out path tracing in Indiana Jones. The 4090 is actually under 60 FPS, but with DLSS performance mode, it can get to 60 FPS. So anyway, it's likely that Doom: The Dark Ages is going to offer a similar setup here. Apparently my own video won't load. There we go. But so that seems to be the case. But I also thought it was interesting when they're talking about ray tracing being mandatory, that they can then count on every PC running it to have ray tracing available. And so I thought that was interesting. So the developers specifically said, when you fire your weapon, the heat detection would be able to tell if you're hitting a pixel that is leather sitting next to a pixel that is metal. Before ray tracing, we couldn't distinguish between two pixels very easily, and we would pick one or the other because the materials were too complex. Ray tracing can do this on a per pixel basis and showcase if you're hitting metal or even something that's fur. It makes the game more immersive and you get that direct feedback as the player. My guess at what they're talking about here is maybe replacing more traditional hitboxes with per pixel ray tracing, which is really interesting. The idea of using ray tracing for a gameplay purpose, if you are going to set a minimum of ray tracing hardware in order to support the game. So there is that. Anyway, like I said, so I think that this game will scale beyond this and with those full RT modes and all of that. The other thing I'll mention, though, is it looks like the CPU requirements are also no joke. A Ryzen 7 3700X or better, Intel Core i7-10700K or better. I understand that those aren't, a 3700X isn't super new or anything, but they are specifying 8-core 16 threads or better. A Zen 2 or Intel 10th Gen or better. Now that's to hit 60 FPS here. Now my guess as to why that would be mandatory, well, if you look at some of this gameplay trailers, like, there's a lot of enemies on screen. When there's a lot of enemies, that generally uses a lot of CPU. And so I would guess that that's probably a big part of what's going on here. If you have big environments with lots of enemies, you do tend to need more CPU power. They are then saying that for 1440p 60 FPS at high settings, they're jumping up to a Ryzen 7 5700X or Intel Core i7-12700K or better, again stressing 8-core 16 thread. Usually, most settings aren't going to increase the CPU load. So if you were hitting 60 FPS here, you would usually be hitting 60 FPS here, except for sometimes there's crowd density, draw distances. Sometimes actually if the BVH structure is getting more complex with ray tracing, there are things that can increase the CPU load. So, but yeah, that is getting up there for sure. Now notice that they don't step it up again when they go up to the 4K Ultra 60. So there's that. Also note, it does look like you will need a 512 gigabyte or higher NVMe SSD with 100 gigabytes available. So basically you need 100 gigabytes of SSD space available. They are stressing they want a fast NVMe SSD. All right, that's what we know so far about Doom: The Dark Ages. Again, it's coming out May 15th. I think I saw the launch price is going to be $80. Not a huge fan of that, but do like me some Doom games. If you guys are interested in me testing this one out when it launches, do let me know in the comments section. And I hope all of you have an excellent day. I've got to get back to benchmarking to get ready for my 5080 reviews now that I just posted some 5090 content and more 5090 content on the way as well. Hope all of you have an excellent day.